Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be going over the Keith Moon sound.
Sally, take my hand. Travel south across land.
We're going to run this episode a little differently than the last one. So I've already got the kit set up. We're still going to do a brief overview of the mics. I'm going to give a little insights on how I mixed in Logic to get this sound, and then I'm going to do some more playing examples. That was one of the feedbacks that I kind of missed out on a little bit, and just kind of really emphasize and exemplify some of the things that Keith Moon does, and especially how you can sound like Keith Moon, because that's a challenge in itself already. You know, I don't want to say that it's easier to sound like other drummers, but in order to sound like Keith Moon, there's very specific things as a drummer that you have to do. Or even if you're a guitarist and you're trying to get your drummer to sound like Keith Moon, you have to give him specific direction, because when you're playing like Keith Moon, you're not playing whatever the hell you want whenever the hell you want. There's very specific moments in which Keith Moon does a Keith Moon thing, and I'm referring to mostly studio recordings. Live, he kind of does what he wants, but it's still in the pocket. And people don't think of Keith Moon as a pocket drummer, and I think they're entirely wrong. Just because he doesn't conform to what the general consensus of what pocket is doesn't mean he's out of pocket. So that's an important thing to think about. But like I said before, we're going to go over the drums, cymbals, tuning, all that fun stuff right now. For my Keith Moon-esque setup, what I have up is my Rogers 70s kit, and this is a Pearl bass drum over here, and I've got a 14x5 Slingerland wood snare. And the tuning is the rack toms are higher, the floor toms are lower, and the reason why the rack toms are higher is because Keith Moon used to tune his rack toms fairly high up until about like 72, 73. Especially you can hear on Quadrophenia the difference between the drum tones there and then the drum tones on Who's Next, which is the record I just did. Snare drum is tuned high. It's dampened with the bandana. Floor toms are pretty standard. Kick drum is also pretty standard. And yeah, that's about it for the drums, at least. For the cymbals, same thing. I've got the same cymbals up for 95% of my videos. I've got a 20-inch Zildjian A, 18-inch Zildjian A, 21-inch Zildjian A. These two are crashes. This one's a ride, but it crashes well. 15-inch heavy Pisces 2002 hats from the 70s. And we'll get into the mic placement in just a second. So don't go anywhere. We'll be back right after the break. So this mic placement is pretty standard, pretty much what you would see, I guess, if you look at pictures from The Who Live in the 70s. I only have 8 microphone inputs, so these are just kind of capturing the rack toms. And the funny thing is when you set your mics up like this, sometimes you'll get more of this rack tom than this rack tom, which is perfectly fine, because if you listen to these recordings, not everything is perfect. Not everything is perfect in the 70s. Don't quote me on that. And same thing going on over here. I've got a room mic in my closet. Snare mic is pretty standard. Overheads are pretty standard. They're up pretty high and they're angled in to capture the whole kit, which is what you want in a sound like this. So with that being said, I'm going to talk about some of the mix details that I did, just briefly. I'm not going to go into great depth because I feel like I don't have that much knowledge to accurately inform the populace upon my decisions. For my Logic template on the Keith Moon sound, what I did is the kick and snare are forward, close mics that is, are forward, and they're a lot more forward than what I would usually do. That's because when you listen to these records, it's kick and snare, and then it's overheads, and then the close mics on the toms are like secondary to all of that. But one thing I do want to touch on is putting your drums in the room. And what I mean by that is when you listen to a record, listen for how the drums interact with the studio they're in. Because if you're in a room like mine, it's not soundproofed. It's not even sound treated. right? So you gotta be mindful of that when you tune your drums, because you can tune them the same, right? But if you go into Logic and you put a super long reverb on it when there's obviously a different sound on the record, you're not going to be anywhere close to what it is. So in order to achieve the sound that I was hearing in the headphones when I was listening to Who's Next, is I put two different reverbs. I put one reverb on the room mic, and that's a chamber reverb to kind of get the attack and mostly for the snare tone, because Keith has a very specific snare tone on Who's Next, and I think it's chamber reverb. Again, I'm not an expert on these things, but this is just what I hear. So what I usually do is I'll just try a bunch of reverbs until I get one that sounds right, or I'll have some favorite presets that I know get close to the sounds that I'm hearing. So anyway, room mic is on a chamber reverb, and then I took the whole drum bus and I put them in Logic as a preset. I don't remember what reverb it's on, but it's like drum booth 2, drum booth 3. It's a medium space, and it sounds really good, because what I do for the drum bus reverb is I'll tickle the drum bus itself with the reverb, just so you get enough presence to cut through the mix. Because I don't want it to make it sound like you're sitting in the back of a stadium and some dude's playing drums in the front. That's not what we're after. We're after putting the drums in the room so they can accurately sound like the record. And that's a big trick for doing stuff like this. So, general recap, kick and snare are forward, overheads and room are very forward, and close mics kind of come second. So now we're going to move on to how to sound like Keith Moon, which is not an easy task, mind you. Typically, when I do a record, I can get the drum sound in one day and play the album the next. So it only usually takes me 2 to 3 days max. This one, however, took about 2 weeks, and that's because A, I didn't have that much time on the kit, and B, going from singer-songwriter stuff to playing like one of the world's greatest rock drummers is quite a mindset change. A couple things that I did to prepare for this was to A, intently listen, and by that I mean not just listening to the drum part, but listening to each part of the song to figure out how the drums were interacting with them. Because if you listen intently to Keith Moon, he's got fantastic ears. I mean, he knows what each individual player is doing. I mean, he's in tune with the vocals, he's in tune with the bass and with the guitar. But a big thing is I remember watching the Classic Albums documentary on Who's Next, and he plays off of the vocals, which is a fantastic thing to do, because in the Who songs, it's pretty much all vocal, except for maybe a little guitar break here and there. And it's just fantastic. If I find a link, I'll link a clip, and you guys can go watch it if you're interested in it. But that was a big thing for me, was figuring out how to play like Keith Moon, because you can overdo playing exactly like Keith Moon. So I'm going to go over some key phrases that I picked up from intently listening to Keith's playing, so you too can sound like Keith Moon, and I'm going to drop just a little hints on how to get an accurate sound when trying to reproduce this for yourself. One of the big parts of playing like Keith Moon is knowing how to hit the crash correctly, like Keith Moon. And what I mean by that is not smashing it. And I'll do a little demonstration to you of it'll just be overheads and room. And that's important because you don't want to cloud up the snare, you don't want to cloud up the vocals, you don't want to cloud up anything else, because these are very high frequency instruments. So with that being said, the reason why Keith Moon the reason why Keith Moon had this over here is because live he didn't play with hi-hats. The reason why I have this over here is so I can switch between these two crash cymbals depending on the chorus or the verse or whatever part of the song I'm playing, because this one is much more mellow of a crash than this one, because this one is heavier. It tends to have a higher pitch than this one, which is lighter. And I'll demonstrate how to play the crash like Keith Moon. And if you ever watch him live, he's not smashing it. You know, it's not a. There's none of that there. What he's doing is he's much more subtle. There's a lot of this going on too. And I didn't do any of that. And the reason why I didn't do any of that is because I didn't think of it until just now, because I remembered during the rock and roll circus, he kind of swishes the crash, which is important because if you swish the crash, there's a lot less pronounced attack on the eighth notes and on the downbeat, really. Because if you play the crash like this, you can immediately hear the difference in the fact that the downbeats are more pronounced, which is fine. And, you know, again, like I said, I didn't think of it until just now. So if I could, I would go back and redo the record, but I'm not going to do that. So, and with that, I'm just going to play a little bit so you guys can hear the difference of what I'm talking about. So I'll do one swishing, one accentuating the downbeats more, and then one playing the crash, how most people would probably play the crash. So I know that demonstration was probably pretty subtle. I didn't want to overemphasize anything like that because I wanted to give like a decent example. But with that being said, keep in mind that cymbals are very high frequency instruments and they take up a lot of space in the mix. And that's important when you're playing live, depending on the room. When you're playing live, you always want to play to the room. So if I'm playing a live gig, I'm not going to smash the absolute living bejesus out of my crash cymbal. I'm going to play it light enough because it's going to swell the more I hit it, right? And especially, you don't want to cloud up the vocals because the vocals kind of live in this range, especially if you're crashing on a heavier cymbal. Don't cloud up the vocals. We want everybody to like us as drummers, and that's important. Well, it's important that they like us, and it's important that we don't cloud up the rest of the band. So I'm going to drop a clip in here, and I'll put some little commentary on the screen about how changing from crashes in chorus and verse can have a great effect. And it really does, because if you go from this in the verse and open it up in the chorus to a heavier cymbal, it's like switching from hats to ride normally. You know, it adds that much more to it. But the clip's going in right now. An important thing to keep in mind with playing like Keith Moon is using your kick drum as a lead voice. And what I mean by that is having that really determine the feel of the song. And you can hear this at the end of Bargain, and I'll drop a clip later on so you guys can see what I'm talking about. And especially on A Quick One While He's Away live at Leeds and kind of through any of their live stuff, the kick drum really is a deciding factor of where the song is going and where the energy of the song is. And that's important to keep in mind when playing like Keith Moon, because hopefully after this video, if you've picked up some tips and tricks, you can take that and implement it into an appropriate genre of it, because you don't want to play like Keith Moon in a singer-songwriter genre. But if you want to have some fun, you can take almost any 60s song and play like Keith Moon, and it raises the energy level. Of course, just make sure people know that you're doing it on purpose and that you're not just some guy who's having fun. I mean, we all want to have fun, but we also just want to keep in mind that other people might not be prepared for you to bust out a sextuplet roll and hit your crash cymbal for 2.5 hours straight. Now, to the people who say Keith Moon can't play slow, can't play a groove, they're entirely wrong. If you listen to Getting in Tune, The Song Is Over, Love Ain't for Keepin', and some B-sides too, he has an interesting way of playing a slow groove. And it's a lurching feel. It's like he wants to play more, but he's exercising a ton of self-restraint to serve the song. And I think a lot of people overlook that when they listen to Keith Moon playing. And I'll drop a couple examples later on, just so you guys can hear what I'm talking about. But the way he does it is it's almost like he's going to be late to the downbeat. And you know what? I want to play a little bit right here just so you guys can get what it sounds like without music too. So the way he does it is, it'll be eighth notes on the hi-hat. It'll be like a slower tempo. But the funny thing is sometimes he'll miss the hi-hat. I don't know if it's on purpose or on accident or not, but you can implement that feel as well. And when he plays it, again, the kick drum is leading. So the kick drum could be going. And the way he plays those 16th notes is it gives it the lurching feel, especially after if you go. Couple that with the hi-hat like this. It's a very interesting feel. And again, people might look at you weird if you decide to go play a ballad like that. But part of that is using these techniques and tricks in the appropriate time, too. If the song calls for that feel, do it. If the song calls for something more straight like this, versus those were two entirely different tempos, and that's my fault. Let's try to play it at the same tempo. But part of that is when you have these techniques in your mind, in your Rolodex of tips and tricks to bust out if you're going to do something like this, use them appropriately. And what I mean by that is if the song calls for a straighter groove, don't implement a bunch of swingy stuff into it. As fun as it might be, you're going to make everybody else a little bit frustrated with you. So again, the feel is appropriate. If the feel is appropriate, by all means, go ahead and do it. But don't show up to play a song where it's a straight-ahead folk ballad, or not a straight-ahead folk, but it's a straight-ahead ballad, and you're supposed to be playing something like this. Don't Keith Moon that. Don't play it like this. Because you're not serving the song. And that's an important thing to keep on Keith Moon's feel. I love Keith Moon's feel. He was the first drummer that I actually really got into. But the same goes for any of the other classic drummers. If you're playing a ballad, don't play a heavy Bonham groove. And again, I'm not hating on Bonham. Everybody loves Bonham. It's just about serving the song. So if the song calls for something like that, if you hear it after listening to these records or reviewing, live footage of Keith Moon playing, by all means do it. Try it out. But if somebody tells you that, hey, that's not the right feel we're going for, don't keep doing it. Switch it up. Play like Kunkel. You know, you can play like Kunkel or Keith Moon, and or you could play like Steve Gadd. It doesn't matter. It's what the song calls for and how you choose to voice that through your own personality behind the kit. And as I mentioned before, Keith Moon plays in between the vocal, and I can't really demonstrate this because I can't sing. You guys don't want to hear me sing. So I'll drop another clip. I think I've said that phrase 5 times, but I'll drop another clip in here just to exemplify what I'm saying. And you can really hear that again in some live takes, but in the studio especially, he'll do I don't know when the vocal phrases end off the top of my head, but he'll throw in a little fill. And speaking of fills, let's go over some Keith Moon style fills. One thing to keep in mind when playing fills like Keith Moon is that A, or number one, if you will, they have to be in the appropriate place in the song. B, they have to be played with the appropriate amount of swing. And C, they have to be played with the appropriate amount of energy. And I'll discuss, there's about 3 fills, 2-ish fills, about 3 fills. We're going to do 3 fills that you can do to kind of sound like Keith Moon. And this will be fill 1. So with fill 1, it's the grouping we're going over is 16th notes. So if you're unfamiliar with that, it's just 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a, you know. Played with both hands, obviously. And what I'm going to tell you to do is to break up your 16th notes between different drums. And so instead of sounding like this, that was a little shorter than the example that I gave. But instead of doing that, let's try this. So it's a shorter fill, which is fine because Keith Moon, sure, there's a lot of long fills, but if you're playing in between the vocals, sometimes that amount of space is all you have. And so I'll play a groove, and we'll do that fill, and I'll do the differences between just playing straight around and breaking the sticking up between the drums. Because Keith Moon has that falling down the stairs kind of effect when he fills, which is fantastic. I think it's fantastic. I've said fantastic 3 times, and you know what? I'm going to say it a 4th time because Keith Moon is fantastic. So yeah, that's one fill, and you can play that almost anywhere. If you're playing a regular groove on the hats like this, you can do it. And that's not to say that Keith Moon doesn't play straight 16th fills, you know, 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a bum. He does, but it's with an appropriate amount of swing. You got to have swing when you're playing like Keith Moon. The other fill is at the end of some phrases. He'll do this a lot, and it's like a triplet herta, so it's like the first or second half of a sextuplet. And he does this either on the snare drum or on these 2 toms is how I hear it. I think sometimes he might do it with his kick drums, but I can't do that. So he'll do that, which is really cool because it's a nice short fill, but it adds a decent amount of interest to the groove. And so what I mean by that is it's just this. Or if it's on the snare drum, it's also just key thing to keep in mind if you're playing it on the snare drum, be sure to start it on the end of 3. So your left hand, if you're left-handed, or if you're right-handed, my bad, the accented note is still on the downbeat of 4. And this is really fun to do in conjunction with the fill before. So I'm gonna do a couple examples, and we'll start off with the triplet fill that I just did, and then we'll add in the other fill too. A key thing when playing like Keith Moon too, and especially when filling like Keith Moon, is to keep your kick drum going, is to keep the eighth notes on your kick drum going when you fill. And I remember watching a video of Simon Phillips telling the viewers not to do that, which is a good tip also, because it'll cloud up the toms. But when you're playing like Keith Moon, you're playing a lot of notes. To me, it doesn't matter. It only adds to the feel because it aids to that falling down the stairs effect, especially if you're playing triplets over top of it, or sextuplets or hertas or anything like that. And you can hear that in the end of Won't Get Fooled Again when he does those fills like this. Again, it adds to the energy. He's leading with his kick drum, because without the fills, or without the kick drum rather, it still sounds cool. It just sounds a little less energetic and less driving. I mean, it would sound like this. Kind of messed up my kick drum pattern there a little bit because I was trying to keep my eighth notes going. But there's a big difference. In context, it makes a lot more sense. Drums by itself, it's somewhat understandable, but especially in context of a song, it makes a huge difference. Fill number 3. This is kind of an intro fill, and I don't know how to explain it, but I can kind of demonstrate it. Is you hear it a lot, it kind of goes like this. So all that is just the first half of it is the eighth notes. So the first half is just, that's 3 eighth notes. And then it goes into sextuplets. And I can't remember where I picked this up from, what song it is, but I know I play it a lot because it's a classic Keith Moon-esque fill. And you can start it on the snare drum too. It doesn't always have to be on the toms. So if you start on the snare, it sounds something like this. So I'll that was a good example of the note grouping right there. I'll slow it down so you guys can, decipher what it is. So the counting of that is 1 and 2, a 3 and a 4 and a 1. And the best part is putting the 4 and a 1 on the toms. And you can start the 1 and 2 on the floor tom like I did previously. So it'll sound like this. And that's really fun because it gives you complete creative freedom within that grouping to start it wherever you want. You can start it on the rack tom if you want. You can start it on the kick drum. It's a great Keith Moon fill. It's a great intro. You know, if you need a whole bar to fill it up instead of just playing in between the vocals to set up a new section. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put all these three fills together in a groove, just so you guys can understand how to operate them. So we'll go over the not lopsided 16th notes, but the broken up 16th note fill. I'll do the triplet one on the toms and on the snare, and then I'll do that last fill, which is usually my intro fill when I want to play like Keith Moon. Oh, I know where I picked that fill up. At the end of Won't Get Fooled Again. I think there's a phrase in there very similar to that. But anyway, I'll play a groove. I'll switch between the crash cymbals and everything like that so you guys can kind of understand what it sounds like in context. So here we go. A couple more things when playing like Keith Moon is be sure to play dynamically. And you can hear this a ton when he's doing it live, is he'll ride on the crash cymbal up here, which creates a lot of space in the high end for the rest of the instruments and vocals to really capture that side of the mix. And he does it all the time. He's a very dynamic player, and I feel like a lot of people overlook that too. Another Keith Moon-esque fill, I mean, this is really just kind of any fill, but you got to play with the right amount of energy, is the eighth note tom buildup. Don't underestimate the eighth note buildup. He does it a lot, and it's a great way to fill up spaces very simply, but adding a lot of energy. And, you know, you can do a Keith Moon face if you want. I typically do. But, it, you know, I mean, it sounds like this. It's extremely simple, but it's an important fill to have in mind to play like Keith Moon because it'll translate through the recording if you play it with the right amount of energy, the Keith Moon energy. You know what? It'll be like this. Don't underestimate that. That adds a lot of power, and you can do that at any tempo, too. I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a 60s song, and I'm going to play it like Keith Moon just to see how it can take the energy level up. But disclaimer, only do this when it's appropriate, all right? Tried to stay to some of those ideas that I talked about in the video. Of course, there's other things that I touched on, or that I played rather, that I didn't touch on. And that's okay, because this is meant to serve as a primer for you to go out and find Keith Moon phrases you like and implement those into your playing. Because I don't want, you know, if you're a drummer watching this, I don't want you to be like, oh, this guy said this is how you play like Keith Moon, so I'm strictly going to do that. Don't do that. You can use those phrases, but gather your own ideas from listening to The Who, from listening to how Keith Moon plays, because that's the most important part, is taking stuff from these classic records and injecting it into your own personality behind the kit. So that concludes the Keith Moon sound video. And as always, if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, or suggestions, please feel free to let me know. Feedback is always welcome. This is still a new format for me, so I'm trying to iron out the kinks, trying to do something a little different with each of them, see how people like it. And I'll be seeing you guys in the next one.